I cannot believe that she's awesome. That's my boss, Kelly. We got our system working tonight. My name is Barb Klunkowski. Where's Maureen? Oh, she'll be back in a minute. Okay, Maureen and I kind of were discussing this whole. Oh, I know. Maureen and I had been discussing at a New Year's party about wouldn't it be great to do a program about fake news, and that's how this whole thing started. This is Maureen McDonald's baby. She is the Vice President of Programming with the Detroit Press Club, which I think is pretty awesome. And she pulled together this wonderful panel, I will let her introduce them here in a minute. While we're waiting for Maureen, it's my job to do the commercials for our other programs. And as you can see, we've got a lot going on at the library. We had a program on hip replacement next door with DMC. We have this going on. Coming up this weekend, we have 2 programs back to back. The first one is at 1 o'clock, The Hustle with Bernice. And I have gone to one of her hustle classes, which I needed desperately, and she was wonderful. So if you don't want to sit on the sidelines at the next party or wedding, I would suggest you come on Saturday to Bernice's program at 1 o'clock. And then after that, there is going to be another program in the meeting room, and it's in here. Anything you need to know is in our spring newsletter, by the way. There's going to be one called Love, War, and Jazz, Black Americans in World War I. That's also on Saturday. Also coming up, if you like to spell, we have an annual event called the Spell Bowl. And you put together a team. It costs $40 to sign up, but that $40 goes to Southfield veterans and their families. So it's a very worthwhile thing. It's a lot of fun if you like that kind of thing. And also coming up on Sunday, March 18th, the Friends are going to have an author's tea. There is a cost of $10 if you're a friend already, or $20 if you're not. And again, the money goes to help the Friends provide programming for the library. You can pick up a flyer for more information. We have all kinds of wonderful things that happen at the library. One of them, one of our most popular ones is jazz and blues. Last month we had Carl Henry, who's just totally amazing on the guitar. Yes, that was an excellent program. And coming up in March 21st, we'll have Jimmy Blues Jazz Trio. It's a cost of $5 or $3 if you're a friend, but it's well worth the cost of admission in a smoke-free environment. Okay, now that Maureen is back. Oh, one last thing. If you really want to learn more about the topic of truth in journalism and fake news, we are going to have another event in September. Sandra Savoda from WDET will be bringing her program here. So look for more information as we get closer to that date. Yes, sir?
Don't forget to mention that next week, I think it's Wednesday, I think Dr. Salvador Salvador, the DIA director, will be here.
Yes, how could I forget? Thank you, yes. Yes, from the DIA. Yes, the director of the DIA will be here, the director's cut, to talk about the history, the paintings, his vision for the DIA. I mean, what's not to love? And it's a free program, so yeah, that's also going to be happening right here. Okay, I am going to be turning this over to Maureen, and I will have to turn the couple mics on.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello. Not really.
Okay.
Hello?
Okay?
No, no.
Hello?
Yeah, we've
I
got,
hope that Mike didn't turn it off.
our monitors in front of us are giving us volume, but I don't hear anything coming out of the speakers in the room.
Oh, guess what? I think that Mike did turn it all off.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to turn that on. Hang on.
While we're waiting, why don't we have somebody in the audience start with what brought you here tonight? Well, we're waiting for the microphones to work. Is it working now? No. Is this working? It sounds like it is.
I don't think it is. You just have a nice voice.
I've been a journalism professor at colleges, so I'm used to voice projection, but if I don't have a voice, let me just, all right, somebody stand up and tell me what brought you here tonight. What do you want to know? Sir? The man in the gray coat. Yeah. What brought you here tonight?
Okay, yeah. He's turning them on.
There we go.
Hello? Okay, it's working.
The lady outside,
Okay.
she said, come on in. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's have somebody else. Who else? Lady in the middle and with the blonde hair and the glasses. Yeah.
Yeah.
What brought you here?
I just found it interesting. There's always good programs here, and so I figured this might be an interesting program to attend. So.
Great. Lady in the reddish scarf.
Right here, in hopes of getting the real definition of fake news.
Real definition of fake news. Okay. Okay, about one more. Vic.
Well, as a former journalist who knows a couple of people up there at the dais, I want to know, what do you do to try to reach an audience that's decided already that they're not interested in what you have to say, your news is fake? How do you reach someone who thinks that facts don't matter anymore and that doesn't want anything that doesn't reflect their own opinion?
Wow. Okay, my name's Maureen McDonald and I'm the moderator. And how this started out was a Christmas brunch at Barb Klimkowski's house, and we were talking about this and that, and I said, you know, if you had a panel on fake news, on divisiveness in coverage and everything, and she said, not yet, why don't you put a panel together? And that I did. I brought people that I know from Facebook and from working, and I said, hey, how'd you like to speak? And they agreed. So I'm grateful that they're here. I'll introduce them in a moment. My background, I've taught at University of Michigan, at University of Detroit, and at Wayne State University, taught various journalism classes, including media ethics. I'm pretty much a Facebook junkie, reading a whole lot of things. And I've also been writing for the Detroit News, the Daily Beast, Automotive News, Ward's Automotive, a whole number of publications. And I'm old enough to remember Walter Cronkite when everything was the news that is today. And it was pretty much an unbiased or pretty relatively open news. And today, if you want one side, you watch Fox, and if you want the other side, you watch MSNBC, and there's this wide gap, and it's widening in between. So I got my buddies here to talk about some of the differences. Eddie Allen is the senior editor of The Hub. He's written several books. He's written for the New York Times, the Associated Press, Thomson Reuters, BET.com, and a fantastic editor at that. Matt Roush, God, I love his Facebook posts. I can find every day something that I want to read, and I could be for hours spellbound by some of the things he shares. I first was a fan of his when he was at Crane's Detroit Business. His stories always stood out because they were lively. And now he's the Publications and Media Relations Director of Lawrence Technological University. Ed Garsten, another one. When he was on Facebook, I couldn't wait to get whatever he had to say. But I first met him when he was the bureau chief of CNN. Quite a background. He was the first bureau chief of CNN when the station first started, the cable news network. And he has since morphed. He was the digital manager at Fiat Chrysler through 3 administrations and 3 languages. And he was the one that helped pioneer corporate news that was kind of built to look as news. And he'll tell you about some of that. Jennifer Cherry Foster has done seminars for numerous years on how to do social media from a public relations standpoint. You know, what is it and how do we use it and what kind of a beast is this thing that's kind of taken over our lives? And she's an expert at all of this, or at least I think so, and many do. So I'm grateful that all of you are here. And why don't I start with, kind of as an opening, have each of us define fake news. On the news the other night, they said fake news was deliberately manufactured news meant to appear real. So I would start, Eddie, what do you think fake news is? No. You want it? Barb?
Is this one up? I think it's just, yeah, it's just the monitor here in front of me this time.
Right.
It's not going out from the speakers. I mean, it's nice I have a monitor because after all my years in radio, I'm kind of deaf.
Okay, let's see if you can hear it. Hello? No?
Just for the monitors.
Is yours working now?
I don't think so, it's just a monitor.
How about, shall we do a sound check? Ed?
I can hear them out of this little bitty speaker right here, that's it.
It's not coming through out here.
Can you hear him back there?
No.
Okay. Well, you know what I may have to do? I may have to get out the handheld.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, do we have, is this one working? We can just pass it around.
That's to the camera.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Don't touch my mic.
If it had a flag on it, I wouldn't have touched it.
Okay. Is it working now? Okay. We've been having a few technical difficulties tonight.
Eddie, come up and use this one.
Okay. Yeah. For the moment while I get out I have a handheld.
So we don't have to spend too much time with this.
Okay. So is this better?
Yeah.
So for me, and actually by definition, fake news is a simple oxymoron. I don't acknowledge the term. I think, politics aside, I think it was popularized by someone very stupid, and popularized by someone very stupid at a time when, as our friend Vic sort of pointed out, although he did it in question form, it was popularized at a time when people are clinging for dear life to the justification of their own views and attitudes and perspectives on the world and life, and tend to want to disregard all differing views and evidence that maybe those perspectives are not quite as solid as they'd like to believe. It's a time, I think, of great insecurity in America that would allow the birth of such a term and its actual popularity. I frankly can't believe people use it at all. It's an oxymoron that means nothing to me personally. What was the rest of that? Was that good? Okay. All right.
Thank you.
I was online yesterday doing a little bit of research for this event, and I came across a website from the University of Michigan on fake news. So if you Google University of Michigan fake news definition, there's a really interesting webpage there that sort of defines different types of what people call fake news, or more broadly, misleading information. There are news stories that are accurate but have misleading headlines designed as clickbait. I saw one today on a left-wing website that said, lawsuit filed against Trump on eve of Russian probe blockbuster. And it talked about the new lawsuit filed against the president by Stormy Daniels. Absolutely nothing in the story about new developments in the Russia investigation, so it was designed to get you to, the headline was completely misleading. And you find that in a lot of places, that's just old-fashioned clickbait on the internet. There are other stories that are completely fabricated, some of them that have a couple of kernels of truth in them, but are otherwise fake. And there's basically there's a couple of well-known websites, like there's a fake ABC News site that's out there peddling some of the most just ridiculous stuff that I've seen people share on Facebook. So my hope here tonight is that I can convince the 30 people who are here, and please all go tell your 10 of your friends. When you see something online, before you share it, check the source material, please. Because almost always in one of these political websites there will be a link to a story from a Reuters, which is a credible source, or an Associated Press, which is a credible source. These are real serious people who want to get their facts straight and are real passionate about that, and don't last long in journalism if they don't. So go and check the source material, please, before you share anything. If it's a site that, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, and boy, I never thought I'd be doing that. You don't know what you don't know, and these days it's getting harder and harder to figure out what you don't know, and you're less and less likely to be confronted with something that you didn't know. So that's sort of my definition.
Ed, do we have a handheld mic for?
Well, I think we've got liftoff. We turned it up in the other.
No. Okay.
You want to check your mics?
This one work?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you
I have
hear
nothing
me?
to say.
Okay.
The first two gentlemen here have covered it pretty well, but, I was thinking of all sorts of definitions of fake news, and I said, boy, I wish something would drop out of the sky that I could attribute this to. And guess what? About 2 o'clock this afternoon, this giant report fell into my email box from Thomson Reuters that did a multinational study on the definition of fake news. Now, I did bring a PowerPoint slide, but I don't know, boy, I hate PowerPoints. So I'm going to spare you and I'll hold it up. I'll hold it up for you and I'll tell you what it says. I'll tell you what it says because you don't have to have a slide. It's a range anywhere from satire. Right? There are people that think the Daily Show is an actual newscast, but right? I mean, millennials, they watch the Daily Show and say, well, I've watched the news, but of course it's not the news. It's satire on the news, but in a way you could make a case and say, well, that's fake news. And the Daily Show would agree with you. Yeah, of course it's fake. We're making fun of the news, and we're making a commentary on the news. But fake news can be anywhere from satire to, blatantly false story to just, shoddy journalism. And I think any of us that have been in the business long enough, who were both on the pulling the trigger on stories and also on the receiving end, and some of us, where I was a journalist and still am for many, many years, but I also spent 11 years at Chrysler on the receiving end of some bad stories. And you talk to the reporter and say, where did you get this information? And I'll tell you an absolute true story. This goes back to 1986 when I worked on the CNN newsroom in Atlanta. And this guy writes a story. His name is Sid. I don't even know if he's alive, so I don't mind telling you his name. His name is Sid. And he writes a story and says, 1/3 of all males over 35 are alcoholics. And I looked at the copy, and I said, according to who?
How you define
He goes, personal experience. So, this has been going on for a long time. And we just have to be very, very vigilant in, taking care of our own houses and doing a clean job. And the gentleman that asked that question in the beginning, you know what? If you lost them, in most cases, you lost them. We're in an era of echo chamber journalism where people want to hear what they want to hear. And if you don't mind, I don't want to take all the time, but as part of that report on fake news, these are some of the quotes they said, and you could tell who had the study done that it was Thomson Reuters, that they wanted a journalist to look good. But these are actual quotes from people that don't trust the media, mostly more of the conservative. I like what Mike Huckley said. If Donald Trump walked across the Hudson River, the news would be Donald Trump can't swim. They're so far left they might fall off the U.S., right? I mean, these are the kind of quotes. Fox News keeps it fair, CNN tells us left-wing lies, and liberal media is full of bullshit and lies, okay? So you're going to believe what you want to believe. People watch these days what echoes their beliefs, and unfortunately, I think if you lost them, you lost them. The people you're going to get are the people that actively seek news that's accurate and fair.
Well, again, I'm last year, and they've done a pretty good job summing it up. I think one of the other things to consider is from an advertising perspective or a sponsorship perspective. We still see a lot of what used to be called advertorial content, and now it's online, it's sponsored content. And depending on your news source, oftentimes that sponsorship label gets lost, misplaced, put on another page. And so you may in fact be reading a news article that was put there intentionally.
That somebody paid for.
That somebody paid for, and wrote it themselves, and it's not acknowledged, or, I mean, I've seen people featured in advertorials, and it's labeled, but it's down at the bottom like it has to be, but they don't see it, and they don't separate out when it's mixed in with standard news articles that's paid content, and it's been very carefully crafted by a marketing department somewhere. So I think that's something that we should also take a look at. I do believe, because being in the social media side of it as well, I do believe that, again, shoddy journalism is also classified as fake news, because what then happens is, if I'm a journalist on a deadline, and again, newsrooms are very short-staffed these days, and journalists are under a ton of pressure. But I've had colleagues who've said, yeah, the journalists will just get me whatever you've got, I'll put something together, I can fix it later. I mean, I gotta get it up first online. I gotta win. And it's incorrect, or could be incorrect, and then people start sharing that, and it becomes a game of telephone. And so that's, by the time, it may have had one or two facts that were not quite right at the beginning, but by the time it gets to the 10th person, they've added their own take to it and extrapolated things that weren't there, and now we've got a bigger problem. So that's part of where it stems from too, but just, again, two important things I think also are part of that definition.
Well, when it comes to fake news, we've got a president that now anything that doesn't agree with him says fake news. And that could be the New York Times, the Washington Post, Daily Kosik, legit publications that are now being called fake. And then we have, as you've said, we have, at the gym you can tell when the gym has got Fox News over here and MSNBC over here, you can tell the liberals are working on the treadmill over here and the conservatives are over here. And they'll wait for a treadmill on their side. Really. And we all used to watch the same channel, good old Walter or David Brinkley. But when it comes to really fake, there was a study about Washington Post did thousands of anonymous posts about the Parkland attack and found a conspiracy in the making. 47 minutes after the news broke of a high school shooting in Parkland, Florida, the posters on an anonymous chat board, Shan, S-C-H-A-N, had devised a plan to bend the public narrative to their own design. Start looking for numerology and crisis actors. So these kids who were weeping and trying to do something because they didn't want to see other kids shot, dead in their classrooms, were called actors or coached by the Democrats. This was a put together thing by a guy named Chan. It soon illustrated how lies thrive on raucous online platforms, increasingly shape public understanding of major events. As much of the nation mourned, the story concocted on anonymous chat rooms soon burst onto YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, where the theory surged in popularity. Things get shared. What used to be, I mean, when you had a newspaper that somebody had to buy the ink, buy the presses, buy the big machines to publish something, it wasn't as fast to get out there. But now, every one of us are a citizen journalist, and I can put something on, and it can go viral and even show up in Singapore. We can bend the news. Not to go on, and I won't stand, but I talked to the president of the Dearborn Chamber of Commerce a couple of years ago. It took almost a year to beat down a parade, an Arab American parade that was anti-ISIS. And they had posters that were anti-ISIS.
They were Arabic though, so.
They were Arabic.
Yeah.
So,
I've lived in Dearborn for 25 years, so this is near and dear to my heart.
Matt, you know this.
Yeah.
Somebody photoshopped and changed the letters that were on the posters to a ISIS recruiting parade.
Yeah.
And for the next year, this poor woman had to shoot down, oh my God, do they really have Sharia law in Dearborn? Are they really recruiting for ISIS in Dearborn?
Well, that, as I say, that'll come as news to our Irish Catholic mayor, and the Italian Catholic guy he beat in the mayor's race last year, and the owners of Lyle's Ham Shop, and the whole thing about Sharia law in Dearborn, it just cracks me up, but it really takes on a life of its own when it's shared by so many people.
Well, because it's so easy to do now. It's a matter of I can just click, I can hit retweet. I don't actually have to absorb the content. I don't have to read the content in most cases, and I don't even know what source it originated from. To Vic's point earlier, you know, Facebook, when you ask somebody, well, where did you read it? Well, I read it on Facebook. I saw it on Twitter. And so, you know, a publication like the Detroit News and Detroit Free Press in some cases gets as much credibility as, you know, Joe Bob's new news site that he threw up 2 hours ago because he shared it on Facebook and a couple of his friends passed it on. And I didn't do my job to look at what that source was and you know, who is this guy behind it and is it credible? I just read the headlines and I agree with that and I hit share and pass it on.
Wow. Annie, where does it come in? You've been writing a publication that has to do with urban affairs and race. And how does fake news and this kind of avid sharing, how does that get in the way of race relations?
Well, I wouldn't say that I've experienced that as a specific disruption to race relations in any of the areas that I've covered. I focus primarily through the hub, and Maureen has been a regular contributor. I focus primarily on the experience of residents of the city of Detroit, which is predominantly a black city. The cultures that make up the neighborhoods are generally left-leaning because of their lifestyle, because of their politics. In terms of the reaction, unfortunately, I think the problem is, again, going back to the discussion of how we bring one another toward the center, if not, God forbid, from one side to the other. I think it goes back to the fact that we essentially stay in our neutral corners and we read what we read and we pay attention to what we pay attention to. And we miss the fact that at the center of this, really, there was a term for fake news before it was ever called fake news, and it was just it was propaganda. That's essentially what it is. This is politics, you know.
Yeah.
You come up with a term that says, "Don't listen to them, you're being deceived." Well, yeah, that's propaganda. That's propaganda by another name. That now is fake news. So I think I just do my best not to report fake news by being accurate in the news article.
True, and I remember the bad days of Detroit when one story after another in the paper talked about how negative, how horrible Detroit was, and how many robberies, how many murders, how many everything going on in the city. It was Detroit is the murder capital with sensational stories of who was shot and why they were shot, and will the last person out of Detroit turn out the lights? Anybody remember that? Yeah. I mean, what did that do for real estate in New Baltimore and Troy and South Lyon?
And I think there's a difference, that we should point out, with respect to everyone and their observations and the things that have been pointed out here. Within these definitions, again, all of this has really been covered. There's poor reporting and there's quality reporting. There's slanted reporting, like that was. That's a part of why diversity in newsrooms, I think, became so important, because there were people who live in the city of Detroit who were absolutely offended by what was written about this city by the newspapers that represented those people. But none of this is new. That's pretty much my view.
It just happens faster now, yeah, I agree.
Matt, have you been looking at any of this, the Russian bots and Facebook and Facebook, YouTube, and how the election might have been tilted?
Well, what they've discovered is that certain people in Eastern Europe, yes, Vladimir Putin has a troll farm in St. Petersburg, Russia, not Florida. And there are also troll farms in other Eastern European countries, Romania, a few others. What they do is they set up fake Twitter accounts that are automatically programmed to respond to certain inputs with certain canned messages, and those get picked up and shared. And it really works. Millions of people saw these things. You even had the Russian troll farm in St. Petersburg organizing anti-Hillary Clinton events in New York City. That hundreds, if not thousands, of people showed up to. I can tell you from personal experience at LTU, Facebook ads are hugely effective, and they're not very expensive. We get thousands of clicks out of a Facebook ad that costs us $125, or promoted content, and that's far cheaper than traditional media, and that's one of the reasons why newspapers struggle, is because the online advertising is cheaper, and in social media, because of the sort of viral effect of people sharing it, if they agree with it, it's really effective.
And you can use it in other ways. When Ed, it was a fascinating the digital platform that you did at Chrysler. Tell us about that, because this was, as news is beginning to go this away and that away and always, Ed figured out a very interesting way to leverage the news.
Sure, thanks for mentioning that, Maureen, because we set up, at the time, was, we think, unique. We know it was unique in the auto industry, and I believe we were one of the first, if not first company, to use the term corporate journalism, and you might go, okay, well, is that a bunch of BS?
Oxymoron.
Oxymoron, you might say that, well, it's a bunch of PR hooey, right? No, I only hired on the team people who were actual journalists. I never hired any PR people. Why did I do that? Because journalists can write, journalists can think fast, journalists have a sense of fairness, accuracy, and perspective. To me, the main tenets of journalism and telling a story properly. So what we did was, I actually set up beat reporters within our company. Each of we called them multimedia reporters in the company, and they each had a beat. And what the beats amounted to were brands, could be technology, could be design, and they had to actually go report on our own company within all of Fiat Chrysler and come up with original stories. Now, the stories could be video packages, like you might see on the news. It could be an entire package that includes video, blog posts, Facebook posts, Twitter posts, LinkedIn, and on all the platforms that the company was on. Now, what the difference was when they put a story together, now remember, we're the PR department, we're going to do everything except have the other side of the story, but we're going to tell our story in the most responsible and truthful way possible, meaning no hyperbole, no exaggerating things that are actual facts. Anything you saw in a story was an actual fact, because we're all journalists, and we made a pact that if we ever made anything up or lied or knowingly put out false information, we quit. We're done. So we hold up all the standards of journalism up to the point where, because we're employed by the car company, we're not going to say, yeah, but that car stinks. Okay, but we are going to tell you all the attributes of the car using one of the other tenets of journalism, which is don't use adjectives, use facts for your descriptions.
No value judgments.
Right.
Right.
Okay, the car is an 8-cylinder car with a turbo. We're going to tell you that. We're not going to say it's fast as ass. Okay, this is that's for the consumer. The other part of this concept was when I pitched a story to a television station. I'll tell you one in particular. We were opening is a story that you know that if they got the release over the transom in the email, they go, oh, it sounds boring. Is the opening of something we called the World Class Manufacturing Academy. Are you excited about this? All right. But this is actually a very cool place. So we did the package of materials in a journalistic way. And when I sent out the pitch to the television station, I said, I'm not going to BS you. Here's the package we did on it. I want you to know exactly what you'd be getting into if you grant some resources to covering this story. This way they knew some of the best interview subjects, the best B-roll they were going to get for their television story, what elements they could get for any social media treatment of the story, so that they didn't come in blind. We were totally transparent so that the stations and the publications knew exactly what the story was about without trying to sell them a bill of goods.
And how did it go over?
Well, you know what? Every station showed up for the opening of the World Class Manufacturing Academy. They all did a story, and I know nobody would have showed up if I just sent the release go, hey, you want to see the opening of the Academy? Well, as it turned out, it had all this high-tech stuff that you had to see to understand what the story was about. The company kept this this philosophy of corporate journalism until I retired a little less than 2 years ago, and they've kind of backtracked. But we did it. We did live shots, live webcasts, live shots like a reporter would do at a TV station or a network. When Sergio Marchione gave a speech, we live tweeted it as if a reporter would, whether he said something we were happy about or not, it went out. So it was a different way of doing things. It took a little bit of courage, but I had wonderful, wonderful people supporting me, an awesome team, and you know, a company that said we want to be that transparent. And it worked out really well, and I went around the country. I went to Europe and spoke about this. And I had a guy from Siemens in Germany, actually, in Wiesbaden, say to me, "You son of a bitch, we could never do that. I must have lunch with you."
Well, this is, and corporate journalism has been around for a while too. There was, back when Rick Snyder was head of Ardesta, which was a venture capital firm investing in microsystems and small technology, he started up a media company called Small Times Media that published a magazine and did a website and did videos and that kind of thing. And it did pretty well for a few years. It kind of petered out when it couldn't attract advertising during a recession. And just today, I read in Cranes that a guy named Doug Song, who founded Duo Security in Ann Arbor, which is a massive cybersecurity firm that's attracted something like $70 million in venture capital now. He is starting a magazine about cybersecurity, and he's hired some pretty high-powered journalists to work at it. And is it legit? I mean, it sounds legit. I guess we'll find out when the first person files a really nasty civil suit against Duo Security. We'll see how they cover it. But so I mean, this kind of thing has been going on for a while, and there is legitimate. Don't hate it just because it's from Chrysler. It could still be a good story. So.
It's an awesome story.
Jen, you look like you're ready to say something.
Well, it's just interesting because it's connected to what we were just talking about. I mean, we've seen, and again, it's not widely known, there have been PR firms or communications entities that have created their own publications that have largely featured their own clients. They haven't had extreme life Eventually it ceases to work. But so many people, you know, I had somebody reach out to me and say, hey, I want to be in this publication. And I said, that's actually a PR firm's publication. And so if you want to be their client, that's great. But, you know, and so they were really surprised because they didn't know what they had been reading online was written by the PR account executive. And if you actually took the time to look, the byline was, you could trace it back to being a PR account executive. So, you know, there are still instances of that we see from time to time as well, both in you know, print and online crops up.
So one of the things I thought was interesting recently is an organization called NewsGuard. Two prominent journalists announced Monday a plan called NewsGuard, which will provide online users with reliability ratings for media outlets. They'll hire dozens of experienced journalists to analyze 7,500 news and information websites, which are mostly accessed and shared in the United States. It'll launch ahead of the November mid-elections in the United States by founder Stephen Brill, who earned Court TV among other ventures, and Gordon Krovitz, former publisher of the Wall Street Journal, said in a statement. They will provide green, yellow, and red reliability ratings for news sources, with green being trusted, yellow for those requiring caution, and red, deliberate purveyors of fake news. So they will provide nutrition labels for each of the 7,500 news sources. It will review, and more detailed analysis for each outlet will explain why a publisher received one of these ratings. So maybe there will be some hope that, like there are some of these goody ones. There's like, it's not, is it Washington Press that looks kind of like the Washington Post, only it has
The
these,
Denver Guardian,
yeah,
fake newspaper.
it
It's
has,
not the Denver Post.
yeah, it has these, you know, it's almost outlandish
It's
facts.
abc.co, it's not American Broadcasting Company.
Yeah, so you really do have to look. Then you also have to look at the date, and I've been guilty of sharing something that turns out was written in 2015 or something like that, because in the exuberance, oh my goodness, this looks interesting. Well, it's old. These days, old, old is maybe more than 24 hours. Everything happens so quickly. We've got many other things. Is there anything you would want to say before we open to the audience? Eddie.
Okay, go ahead.
I didn't hear the rest of the question.
Something else you want to say before we open it up to the audience? Some factoid, something you want to say? We haven't talked about drastic cuts in journalism and how that's affected.
I have some slides on that.
Do you?
Yes, I do.
Okay, you want to put them on? You've
Sure.
got.
I've got like 5 or 6 slides, so bear with me. This is actually for a report I did internally at LTU. Some of these slides. This is some research I did for a report internally on LTU on our public relations performance, and I was attempting to explain to the people at LTU why the news clipping service Burrell's, which tracks mostly the print media, our mentions are going down on Burrell's, but the media monitoring service Meltwater, which tracks mostly online media, our mentions are going up, way up. So this is why the print ones are going down. You can see the blue line there is the number of U.S. households. The red line is daily newspaper circulation. There used to be more daily newspaper circulation than there were households, which means a lot of people were buying 2 papers. Can you imagine? This is daily and Sunday newspaper circulation from 1950 through 2010. Since 2010, that decline is accelerating. We've gone from 63 million, roughly, paid daily circulation of newspapers in America to less than 35 million. This is the really awful chart if you're a reporter. The blue line at the top is employment at newspapers. Now, not all those people are in the newsroom. Some of them are in advertising and administration and printing and that kind of thing. But we've gone from 450,000 people working for newspapers in 1990 to less than 200,000 today. The green line is employment at online media. And you can see it went way up during the dot-com boom and then kind of fell off through the 2000s. and now it's going back up. And something very important happened in 2016. There are now more people working in online news than there are in newspapers. So that's a real sea change. It makes sense. You know, for lack of a better word, reporters and editors at newspapers used to be kind of information cops. And like cops, you know, some of them were great and some of them were good and some of them stunk. But they were information cops and they sort of patrolled the information that got out to the public. They couldn't put people in jail, but they could make them look bad. So it makes sense to me that there's more information crime with fewer information cops. It's a pretty, you know, clear relationship. This is where most, you know, people report getting the most news. TV is still #1, followed by online now. Radio and print newspapers in last place. Not just web, but mobile. It really is everyone walking around with their phones all the time. This is from 2013 to 2016, the percentage of people who report getting their news often from online sources. People still trust local news organizations, though. 80%, 82% trust them a lot or some, and only 34% can report that for social media. This is just a couple of examples that I found today, in fact. Somebody got arrested at the church where all those people got shot in Sutherland Springs for yelling at the pastor, saying he was going to hang him and pee on him and set him on fire. And these two people, you know, you could say, well, it was just a nut. Well, it goes beyond being a nut. Later in the story, this guy has a website where he calls himself a journalist and promotes investigations, falsely claiming that the government is staging these mass shootings. So that's sort of the definition of fake news right there. And you're fighting more and more of this. This is another one that's a favorite of mine. You see it online all the time, that the Irish were also slaves. No, they weren't. They were indentured servants. I mean, indentured servants were treated pretty badly, but that lasted 7 years, and then you got your freedom, and that lack of freedom didn't pass on to your children. And you had to be treated like a human being by the courts. So that's a complete fabrication. But you see it online all the time. I see it all the time. It just drives me nuts. So that's end of my slides. So.
Anyone else? We have, let's see, so we have digital, is there anything else?
Yeah, I'd say something, because a lot of people blame the 24-hour news cycle on the degradation of journalism. And I don't know, I worked for CNN during 20 of what people would call their golden years, before Anderson Cooper, before Don Lemon, before these personalities, where in our headquarters in Atlanta, there were no pictures of any air personalities, and there were posters that said the news is the star. Okay, Christiane Amanpour was a desk assistant on the foreign desk and got coffee for people, and my wife worked in the CNN library and got Katie Couric file tape when she was a production assistant. Anyway, these were the years when we were in a 24-hour news cycle. We were on the air 24 hours. There's no excuse for not getting a story. You can't say I'm waiting for the next newscast because you're on all the time. However, that was no excuse whatsoever for inaccurate reporting. People that were shoddy reporters, were sloppy editors, were immediately let go. Immediately. When we filed a report from the field, if you know the process of putting a television story together, you write a script and then you have to get it approved before you can lay down the voice track so the editor can create the package. Well, I can tell you that we went through living hell before you could get to the point where you could even lay down your voice tracks. So we got to the point where the piece could be on the air, and that was in a 24-hour news cycle. Of course, we did tons and tons of live coverage, but the live coverage was under scrutiny, and if you just pulled stuff out of your butt and went on the air with it without proper attribution and it was false, well, that was the end of you. Okay, so I can't go with the fact that it's simply the 24-hour news cycle, and that the dedicated news cycles that gave reporters time to check their facts is what's caused this problem. The problem is that when you had your graph with the number of journalists going down, it's not only because there's no newspaper jobs and there's fewer newspapers, but in fact, fewer people believe they have to be trained as journalists, so they're not going to journalism school. I got my master's at University of Arizona. At the time, it was a school of journalism. When I got my master's in the 70s, well, unfortunately, so few people registered for journalism program that it went down to just a major, because they think in this day and age, you've got a keyboard, no matter what it is, you could throw any dreck online and call yourself a journalist. Well, I'm sorry, but if I put a Band-Aid on your cut, that doesn't make me a doctor, okay? So journalism is a profession, and people have to understand that if you want stories told to you effectively, accurately, with the right perspective, that you can trust, you need someone who's a trained journalist, just as if I wouldn't have a carpenter do my plumbing. And yeah.
Well, I think in some cases, it's back to what we said earlier, is we don't have anybody in the newsrooms anymore, which is the problem. I mean, I can call and I can, pitch a story to an editor or reporter, and they can say, that's a great story, I love it, it's timely, but I'm the only one here, and I'm not talking about, there's a small startup outlet. I'm the only one in the newsroom, and so I've got A, B, and C that have to be done, and so I can't do that. And we're seeing, more and more outlets that, out of necessity, I'm not at all blaming any, they're swimming for their lives right now. I mean, pulling quotes. You'll see references as written in a press release, that I received, because they're trying to work with the resources they have and get as much done as possible without the support anymore.
I can give you two examples of what's going on in newsrooms now. When I worked at the Kalamazoo Gazette from 1987 to 1991, there were close to 60 people in that newsroom. Last I heard, there were 16. And how they put out that paper every day, I have no idea. Based on that staffing level. The other time was when I first got to Lawrence Tech, when you're a new PR person, you try to meet all the reporters that are covering your beat. And so I called up an education reporter and said, can I take you out for a cup of coffee and just find out what you're interested in? And she said, no, we're far too busy to take breaks. And I said, does the Department of Labor know about this? Because last I heard, you're supposed to get a half hour for lunch. I mean, come on, but no. Yeah, it's insane what's going on in newsrooms. And I don't mean to say by citing all these newspaper statistics that I think all online news is direct. There are websites, here in Michigan, they're doing a fantastic job. Bridge Magazine is great, The Hub is great, D-Business is great, Curbed if you're into real estate and housing. I mean, there's some quality online content. But it seems where the rubber really kind of isn't hitting the road is the meat and potatoes journalism of the city council and the school board and stuff like that. And I got to tell you, without the Detroit Free Press and the Detroit News, those newspapers that printed on paper, get your fingers dirty type things, without the Free Press and the News, Kwame Kilpatrick's still mayor.
Yes.
Mayor for life?
Yeah, well, unless he wanted to run for some higher office, and he might have. So that whole pay-to-play culture would still be there, and you could argue it probably still is in some form, but it's what those people do with local politics journalism is important, and that's the part of it I don't think is getting done. I mean, the feature section seems to be stronger than ever in these online publications. But Bridge does good public policy reporting, and I've enjoyed a lot of stuff in the Hub too. So thank you.
And it's hard to believe that here in the Motor City, Jeff Gilbert on WWJ is the single only broadcast journalist dedicated to covering the automotive industry full time. That no stations except WWJ have an automotive reporter. I mean, how insane is that? And when I was at Chrysler, I get these reporters showing up to cover the company. And they had no idea. They had no. I had a guy come. Right, I'm a Chrysler, right? The guy asked me when the new model of the Impala is coming out. I said, I don't give a fuck. Sorry, but the guy had to How to be spoken to.
But that's, Matt's lucky, there's still some education beat reporters, but a lot of the other beats have gone away, and so just because they don't have the history, when you had a reporter that had covered a beat for 5-10 years, they understood. I was doing some work with a jeweler who was extremely well known across Southeast Michigan who passed away, and I had to call and re-educate people because nobody was left that would have known or would have been involved and would have had the relationship with him.
Doug Schuba.
Doug Schuba.
Yeah.
And so that can work in your favor as a PR person sometimes, that can work against you sometimes, so.
Yeah, the only publication I know of that still has reporters who've been around a long time and are real experts on their beats is Cranes. That's like the only one left, so.
It's true, what we called legacy. If you have a plumber that's been at it for 20 years, you go, yes, and he's still got his knees. He knows exactly where to find or what's going on. And in journalism, God, how do you trust this blog by someone that does navel gazing? I think this is important because, no questioning. So now it's time for you to do some questioning. We obviously are a little biased and we like journalism because we've all been a part of it, but for you guys, Esther.
Okay. One of you talked about a little bit about Snopes and other sites that people use to check out validity of articles.
Good question.
I think Snopes started out as a project of a public library in suburban Los Angeles. It's sort of taken on a life of its own now. I consider it a pretty credible source.
Absolutely. Wish more people would look at it.
Yeah.
Good one. With your hand up.
Yeah. So talked about. I mean, a lot of people get their news from, or maybe the majority get their news from the web now. When you use the word news, that gives it some credibility. So, AOL News, Yahoo News, Google News, but who's producing that? I mean, you talked about journalism schools, and are these real journalists that are? I mean, every time I open my AOL email account, they're showing me a story. I don't look at it because I don't really know the training of the people who are doing these stories.
Very often that's what they call aggregated news, which is, and nowadays I don't know who's going to be doing the original news as the numbers shrink and shrink. But aggregated news, if you look and you see Associated Press, a lot of the news on Yahoo, Apple is Associated Press, and it'll attribute it right at the lead.
Yeah, I get news alerts through MSN on my computer because it's a Microsoft computer. So, but that almost all of that is from real legitimate news sources like the Associated Press or major newspapers or Reuters or something like that. I mean, it may say MSN News on it, but it's once again that's what I keep going back to is go a step beyond the initial post if you're looking at stuff on the web. Find out if it's original reporting or if it's, from a credible source.
So what about YouTube and Facebook?
Well, it depends on it depends on where it comes from. In Facebook, some people will share things from Reuters, from Yahoo News, from legitimate news sources. Some people will also share something that comes from who knows where. Those are the ones you got to watch out for. What did you say? The abc.co?
.co, yeah, right.
That these make sure. And the minute you get down to the third graph and they say send us money.
Well, actually, the Guardian, which is a good, if left-leaning newspaper from England, is asking for money in every story. So that's
okay.
That's soccer coverage.
Because of the framework, a lot of people don't check those articles when they're in Facebook. They click the link, they don't look at the header, they just read the article, they read the headline on Facebook, enshrouded in Facebook, and then they take it as gospel truth and move on, and that's when I say, well, where did you see that? What was the source? Who wrote that, and why did they write it? I don't know, I read it on Facebook, or I clicked the link on Twitter.
Would the panel agree that there's really like three segments to the news consuming public? On the one hand, there's the one extreme where people think that the Bush administration was responsible for 9/11, and you're never going to convince them otherwise. On the other hand, you have people who make an effort to find well-sourced news. But where the rubber meets the road is in the vast middle ground of people who find their information online, who either don't have the time or the privileges to determine whether it's right or bad.
That's a really good summary. If, we got somebody, you had your hand up.
I have a question for the panel in reference to the consolidation of media. Gannett owns both the Detroit News, the Detroit Free Press. They've taken down the circulation.
No, they don't own the news. The news is owned by a separate company, but they do own the Free Press, the Lansing State Journal, and a whole bunch of other things.
My apologies. Yeah, in terms of the consolidation of Gannett owning the Free Press, taking down the distribution from 7 days a week to 3 days a week, what does the panel envision that with this consolidation movement, will people, we see the numbers coming down in terms of who subscribes, but are you concerned with the consolidation of media, and if Detroit, we may only have one paper at some point because they can't sustain themselves?
Yeah, it's a real concern because the fewer outlets you have, the fewer, the smaller array of opinion that you get in perspective on stories. But I'll tell you, I get the paper 7 days a week delivered to my home. We searched high and low to find someone that would bring us the paper the other 4 days, and never stopped.
But in terms of this, there's some final point. The cost is, the subscriptions are so cheap now. I mean, they're almost giving the subscription for the Free Press is so low. Are you concerned that at some point,
of course,
that model will not exist?
Yeah, the publisher of the New York Times was quoted, I think it was last week, is saying, yeah, we'll do a print paper for 10 more years and then we'll see. So.
If 10 years. Steve, I'll get you after I get Vic.
Well, Maureen, this is less of a question than it is an attempt at an explanation. I'm a former newspaper editor. I'm familiar with the work of everybody on this panel. I've edited the work of 2 of them and count them as my friends. I have another former colleague who's sitting in this auditorium with me right now, though she was not technically speaking a reporter or an editor. She was still an extremely important part of the newsroom where we met and became friends. I think a lot of the problem that the mainstream media has, it can blame itself for shooting itself in the foot. Because I used to be one of those cops. I used to be the guy who checked the spelling and the grammar and checked the facts and had the right to say to the reporter, wait a minute, I think you missed something here. Why don't you call this guy again? I had the right to say, wait a minute, let's hold this story until we can get more confirmation on it. It used to be more important to be accurate than it was to be first. Now the attitude is, let's just throw it up on the web. If we're wrong, and if somebody knows, and if they bother to let us know, if we feel like it, maybe we can change it. I think it's more important to be right than it is to be first, but apparently the folks I used to work for don't believe that. And the stuff that I see online from what I used to think were gold standard newspapers in terms of bad spelling, bad grammar, bad fact checking, shoddy reporting, and I could go on and on and on. It gets worse every day, and if people look at it and can see that it's poorly done, why should the media expect to be respected if you can't do a respectable job?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's the death spiral. I mean, advertising revenue goes down, so you cut staff, so the content gets less compelling. So readership goes down, so you cut staff, so the content gets less compelling.
Yes.
You know.
Oh my God.
Eventually, the plane crashes.
Whoa, Steve.
Question for anybody on the panel: is there anything you can think of that could be done or should be done in order to promote media literacy in high schools or general public or in any realm?
I wish they teach it in social studies.
We have a teacher of social media, media literacy back here.
Okay.
High school?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Teaching media literacy in high school, college?
It's like we have a mixture of like high school students because we're dual enrollment over at Harrisburg College. So yeah, that's what the basis is, and making sure that they understand what like satire is versus a real story. Because a lot of these kids, and I can't, sorry guys, but adults too, there seems to be like a huge technology gap in when it comes to age and not being able to tell whether or not something is fake. Like this morning, one of my older cousins shared a Facebook post. Have you guys been seeing the Ewan McGregor dressed up like Obi-Wan Kenobi? Yes. And everybody's saying, I bet you wouldn't post this on your wall because if you don't like Jesus or something like that. Yeah, and she posted it up on her wall, and it was like, you do know that this is Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars, right? Oh. Yeah. So that's what we're trying to do.
That's the modern equivalent of the chain letter.
Yeah, exactly.
So, let me ask another question. How common is a program like yours in schools today? Is yours very rare?
Very, like departments like ours, because it's in the arts program, they're finding a less and less need for us. And so we're, like Wayne State University, that's where I got my master's degree from. They have an excellent journalism program, U of M, Michigan State, but a lot of them are getting rid of like their theory classes because they want to push them more towards like social media and like I've been hearing all night these stories wanting to get out. As far as like teaching media literacy, that is like one of the very important things, especially in this day and age, especially for young kids. And I think LTU has an excellent journalism program as well. So yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah. Good job.
I tend to go on tangents.
You have, I don't know your name.
Ken, my question was, does fake news catch fire because of fake history, American history? You know, because we live in a country where we have American history is not taught equally, I think, in public schools, particularly in terms of race relations. This is where a lot of these fake news stories catch fire, because basically if we had a centralized organization of American history, a lot of these fake news reports on the internet wouldn't catch fire. You know, we have, you know, you just got finished talking about you lack journalism skills because people are not going through school, journalism school. We have a history, I believe, that's taught in one point of view. It's not inclusive. It doesn't include all the races that make up or the melting pot of America. We have a history book that doesn't do that. And I think a lot of these fake news stories catch fire because the way history is taught in school and what people see in school, the media, and the propaganda we just talked about, it doesn't take a lot for some of these fake news stories to catch fire from the way they've been brought up in educationally.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting point. It's not something I had considered, but I do think, I think you raised some really good points. I think even underlying that are the more recent, excuse me, the more recent iterations of history. My feeling really is the stage was set in recent history. I think that a lot of this really stems from Obama backlash. The fact that there are people who are still very, 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 very angry that there ever was a black president, never thought it would happen, aren't happy that it happened, and the president now, who was the one who claimed that the president that they never wanted in the first place wasn't born in America. You know, these are historical, I think, ramifications to what you're talking about. So I think you have some valid points, but it's not something I consider.
Yeah, like for example, you know, like the dime store, not dime store novel that Western artists used to write about American Indians, laid the groundwork for, you know, the massacre Indians. What they put in a dime store novel book got the Easterners all upset or gave them stereotypes with the Indians, and then, you know, all you have to do is say one thing and things will catch fire because they already had a perception of what they thought Indians were like. You know what I'm saying? So that's why this, like I say, fake news, fake history, we don't have a centralized American history book, you know, to take care of some of this fake news. You know, we got universities today that American history is not even a requirement today. You know what I'm saying? So people come out with these certain stereotypes of what they think this particular race is or this other race is, and that's why these fake news stuff catch fire. We have to get back fundamentally to have a centralized American history book that can counter some. It's not going to counter all of it, but it should counter some of the things that people think, because it doesn't take too much for somebody to form an opinion. And you're already talking about these newsrooms. They depended more on what people get off their phones now for news.
Well, but Sarah, you're making a good point, and in terms of where we are is just what's happening right now. Sarah was saying that they don't know how to discern between satire and real. And you have, and when I was teaching media ethics, people, if you asked them what was their number one go-to source for news, it was Jon Stewart and The Daily Show. And Jon Stewart is now the producer of Stephen Colbert. And if you watch Stephen Colbert, if you thought that was real, you know, where he's got this whole fascinating, funny monologue, and maybe there's truth, but then it's been exploded and manipulated and whatever, and it's funny. It's really funny. But is it true? And, you know, we're entertained by news, so, but it does dilute that which is news. And history books, if you could find one that we could all agree on anymore, I mean, schools are still banning To Kill a Mockingbird. They're still banning it. They're banning Mark Twain, who's in the lobby here, Huckleberry Finn, and saying it's a rabble-rousing book. So, I mean, history...
There are some very uncomfortable truths in American history that are not commonly taught in schools. And when it comes to civics, I think there are a lot of high schools in this country where, unless you take AP US History or AP Government, you learn very little in the way of civics, too. You never learn how government really works. So, I mean, and that's a problem. That sets people up, you know, to be manipulated. It sets people up to be sort of willing recipients of this sort of manufactured ignorance.
And then you have, I mean, what's government when you see, when the Americans with Disabilities Act was being decided upon, and they're hurting the people in the wheelchairs and the walkers and all that, and they're pushing them out of the Senate gallery so that they can't be seen. How does that tell you what civics is today? It's, you know, we can't, the history books, so many different things are going on, and just try to discern what's news. What's great is that all of you have opinions. There's a lady back here.
Yes. I'm a journalism student at MSU, and I don't think the problem with millennial journalists is that we don't know what fake news is. I think the problem is our professors are not teaching us how to find real stories. So when you're on deadline and you see on social media, well, if I just make up some type of gossip, this is going to get 1,000 clicks. You just write anything. So what advice would you give young journalists? Because we're not being taught, go out in the real world and talk to people.
There's something called the Skim. Have you seen that? It's like news for millennials. If you check skimm.com, I think it is, and it's sort of news with a little bit of attitude, which attitude usually means here's my opinion on whether this is interesting or not. I think there's some damn good professors at MSU. Lucinda Davenport's wonderful, the chair of the department. You know, there's a lot of news classes and news generating. Joe Grimm, have you had Joe Grimm?
No.
Do take a class from Joe Grimm.
I'm a senior now, so I'm done, but I'm in my 400 level class, and like last Thursday we were being taught where to put a comma. And it's kind of like, really, I'm a senior and we're being taught where to put a comma. People still don't know.
Wow.
Find yourself some long-term journalists that'll meet with you, and if you want to see me afterward, there's one or two I could recommend also that would be happy to sit down and talk with you about that.
Me too. In Lansing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Judy Putnam.
Judy
probably
Putnam.
have some others, but at the Lansing State Journal's phenomenal.
John Lindstrom at Gonwer News Service too.
Yes, John Lindstrom. We went to college together. Yeah, there's good people. You know, if you're not getting, also talk to Lucinda. If you feel like all you're learning about is commas, go to the chair of the department.
I'm grateful for that too. Thank you. So I'm grateful that they're learning that as well.
That's true.
Because we don't use that often anymore either. So.
That's true, that can get, who was Faulkner, wasn't it, that wrote like 4 or 5 pages and the bear, with no, with, I think 3 commas and 1 period?
What's the mean?
Yeah.
Yale doctor was famous for a page and a half sentences.
Yeah.
Have you seen the meme on social media that says, let's eat grandma, let's eat grandma, save lives?
That's a great example. Okay, other questions? We got Bill Mihalik. Who, if you haven't, find out, try to get a hold of Bill's Pills. This guy has a daily, he takes news events and then does this absolutely fun fugue where he adds his own comments about it. And he's written jokes for David Letterman and others. So Bill.
Fake news with a twist. I know we've been talking about fake news, but I wanted to ask you about the other end of the spectrum, which I guess would be factual news.
That's good.
I mean that not as a joke because I don't really know what you're supposed to call it, but in addition to factual, also, let's say fair and balanced. And the question is, if Fox and MSNBC were to each do stories about the Stormy Daniels situation, and they were each factual, fair, and balanced, would they end up with the same stories if they were legitimately each factual, fair, and balanced, or is there enough wiggle room within the industry?
Wiggle room in a porn star story?
Is there enough room there within that definition that they could come out with very different coverages and still meet industry standards?
You know, part of the problem is that different networks can do the same story, as you say, and have the same basic set of facts, but where they start going this way and this way is where they take the cheap way out, because instead of filling out the coverage with more facts and deeper reporting, they put these paid talking heads on the set. And that's where it starts diverging. Fox is going to have their talking heads, CNN's going to have theirs, MSNBC, that supports the view of their perceived audience. And that's where it starts going to hell. You start with the core of a good story, and then it's analyzed to death to meet the expectations of a certain audience.
The other thing that happens is that the reason Stormy Daniels is news is because people, clickbait. A number of you have used clickbait, and what do you repeat on Facebook and tell your friends about is a story about a porn star having an affair with the president is an easier story for people to talk about and put on the news than it would be to talk about tariffs. I mean, it's hard to understand economics. It's hard to understand, we don't have the staff that can really go through the file cabinets, go through the computers, find out what people are voting. The story on the NRA, how fast did it go through with who's subsidizing the NRA? How much are they subsidizing? It was like news for a day or so. This could be, in an old news cycle, that could be a month's worth of stories. But we're getting a month's worth of Stormy Daniels.
The news outlets have cut investigative journalism. I mean, the news outlets have cut investigative journalism because of the sheer cost.
Yeah, when I was at Cranes, they took me off of pretty much everything else I was doing to put a crooked business consultant out of business. And I spent like 6 weeks on this story about a guy named David Massajuski, who went by Dave Mack. And what he would do is he would talk to small manufacturers and say, I can sell you to the big guys like Bosch and companies like that, back during a big period of auto supplier consolidation. And what he would do is he would take their money and then quit returning their phone calls. And he always took just enough money to where he was under the circuit court limit for being sued, so he'd get sued in district court. And he did this to literally dozens of people. And so I spent weeks going through court records and interviewing these guys and trying to interview him, and of course he dodged me. And then I had to sit down before we ran the story with Crane's libel lawyer, and he looked at the story literally sentence by sentence and said, how do you know this? How do you know that? And I had to show him something that showed how I knew that. And that takes time, and obviously it took money for my salary. I don't think there's not a lot of that kind of thing still going on, you know, and that's where they really cut back.
And that Stormy Daniels story, you know, it's interesting. Does the panel really feel that fundamentally people would rather be entertained than informed? In which case, we've met the enemy and he's us.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Neil Postman wrote the book back in the 90s called Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Yes.
Probably one of the best books ever written on the topic. And, pretty much he said, I mean, when you think about a president who's was a reality show host before this and played You're Fired, and what does he do in office? He fires everybody or else they leave. We're entertainment oriented. This is what makes news, and I was reading, there was an interview about the guy that invented the like button for Facebook. Actually regrets what he did. Because clickbait is what it's all about, again and again and again. And I've even talked to reporters who have said they could spend all this time talking about some very complex issue in a court. But what do people care about? Nasser, because he fiddled women.
I think that continues until the next big recession or depression. You know, I think that's when we get serious again, because we got pretty serious in 2008. You know, so and I think that's the only thing that's going to stop it, basically, and it's unfortunate.
Pardon?
Yeah.
The cameraman, Greg.
Hi, I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about the line between mainstream press, fake news, and the alternative press and advocacy journalism.
The line between it, is that what you're asking?
Right. Do you guys feel that there's a role for the alternative press and or the advocacy press? And if you do you feel that there's a line between, could you describe what you feel the line between that and fake news is?
Well, for me, again, I really don't acknowledge the term fake news. I think it's kind of pointless to buy into the concept. I would say probably for my money these days, advocacy and alternative press is just about the best hope for what's real, true journalism, journalism that seeks to inform and enlighten. That's what the alternative press and the advocacy press has typically done. The danger with the advocacy press sometimes is what they're advocating and the inherent agenda. But for the most part, I think that's kind of where it's at these days. If you hope to have something that will be that will have the objectives of journalism in mind, that's my feeling.
Afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. Right. That's what does it.
We worked at it. We got a couple more questions, and then what's our time limit?
I think we can go another 15 minutes comfortably.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll get back to Ken.
I feel compelled to point out that the first sex story I can recall was in the Bible.
Good that you can recall that.
Is that from personal experience?
What?
You mean Pete Beverly?
But the Stormy Daniels piece for analytical journalism, I would submit, is significant. Yes, there is I'm going to use a delivery. There's a titillating aspect to this. But it is also, from an analytical point of view, symbolic of what we're going through right now. And it is how, for example, an administration treats women. Yes. Larger issue. How incompetent lawyers bilk clients or just don't know what they're doing. It is, and back to history, the problem, first let me back up and say, American libel law, it was New York Times versus Sullivan, Birmingham, Alabama. Bill Connor, who was the white racist chief of police down there. American libel law, God bless it, says that truth is a defense, which is why your lawyer was saying, where'd you get this, where'd you get that? And that came from biased history or acting out an old script about race relations in America.
Can you raise your voice, because I think the lady back there said, we don't have a hand mic, a handheld.
Yeah, we don't have the.
And some people in the back can't hear you.
American libel law, which is part of this and history is part of this, truth is a defense. The American political system is based on a constitution that historically, if you look at it, was a bunch of rich white guys, some of whom owned slaves. But they gave us, I would submit, the finest political document in the 18th century. And it's taken us, and we're still at this is a work in progress, it's taking us a long time to follow the implications of the Constitution. And that includes women's rights, well, we didn't let women vote. The black problem, which was clearly on view.
Please be advised
with
that the library will close in 30 minutes.
I'll try and stop it.
If you need
I mean, you have a president who thinks that
you're calling for a ride home.
That we don't have a birth certificate to Obama.
Right away.
But the Obama issue just raised the old race relation problem again. Here is a legitimately elected president who happened to be black. And it did raise the fact that we have not resolved the question of race. And it's not just white and black. If you know the history of Bitter Tears, Johnny Cash was a Cherokee Indian. I mean, that record was boycotted for telling the truth. And on and on and on. Journalism, I would submit, at its best, and even sometimes when it veers off into different opinions, supports the Constitution. And if you know a better political system, and I've worked all over the world, I don't. It's imperfect. We seem to have gotten ourselves into a rut right now. But I have this faith that says the country, the Constitution, what we ultimately stand for, is bigger than anybody starring in that tawdry cast of characters along the Potomac. So, take us for what we are, think about it, and just keep the faith. We're going to get through this.
I just want to address something that Bill said before that, and one of you might be able to do it, but there is a kind of a difference in the way any story, whether it's Stormy Daniels or anything gets reported on Fox News or Breitbart News or gets reported on NBC and MSNBC. There's a different slant. On one side, what are you guys?
Well, I mean, you send out a press release. This has been going on since the advent of PR people, and they read a press release and it's got facts in it, and they send that out to a bunch of journalists. And you know, when you train people, they get started. Wow, they sent out a press release to all these journalists. You know, they're all going to cover it. Nobody turns out the same story. Everybody's got their own personality. They'll look at something that we send, and it's you know, here are the basic facts. This guy, I just did this. This guy wrote a children's novel. And I got a call from a reporter, she, oh, this is great, I want to do this story, and I really think it's how you can have a full-time career and how you can do your creative works at night and keep two jobs at the same time. And I thought, I never would have looked at it that way, that's really interesting. And so everybody plucks their own angle. It's amazing to me, some of the things that journalists can come up with and see in a basic list of facts that I send them.
So it is good. And speaking of facts and stuff, Ed Garsten told me one interesting story one time where they sent out there was a release. Was it you or Betty Newman? Sent out a release about a new vehicle, let's say the Pacifica, and somebody, they had like 3/4 of their facts wrong, and they went to try to find this person that had written this blog that was just so massively inaccurate, and there was no editor, there was no, there was a URL, but there was no way to contact this person. And to try to get the facts right, and here's a story that goes all over the place, riddled with errors, and one of the problems that you have is when somebody each has their own take, but if there's no ability to find out where this is, I remember you were just kind of like frustrated about that.
Well, yeah, because you don't know where these stories are coming from, and in many cases you don't honestly know who's writing them. They hide behind screen names or pseudonyms or whatever, and you can't find them. But I will tell you this one story though. This guy had a blog. This guy from Kentucky had a blog about Jeeps, and he did some bad stuff, and it was really bad stuff. And we found out who he was, and guess what? A couple of Chrysler security guys knocked on his door one day and scared the crap out of him. And I assure you his accuracy went up after that.
Yeah, I have tried to find people with, news outlets that I'm trying to pitch LTU stories to, and there's no phone number, there's no list of emails. It's just weird. Some of these websites that just seem to exist in the ether. I'm not sure how to get a hold of them sometimes.
I've contacted their hosting companies and everything else in order to try to reach them. If you're curious about how fake news, for lack of a better term, proliferates, there is kind of an interesting website called getbadnews.com, and it's pitched as kind of a game, but you can actually go in and it'll give you scenarios, and you can pick and choose, like you were posting, and it ranks, it'll give you a list of followers, like you're on Twitter, for example. And depending on your choices, your number will go up or go down, depending on how many people would have shared it. So it's kind of fun and interesting to follow that.
Getfakenews.com?
It's getbadnews.com. I think is the actual website, yeah.
Ooh, that's good. Yeah.
But it's interesting to watch if you haven't, how does this proliferate like that? How can I, as someone just sitting at home with my own personal agenda, how can I get it spread out there so quickly? It's just a person, and this kind of gives you some insight into that.
I've got Vic and then Bart.
To try to tie a couple of things up into a package that people have talked about in the last few minutes, specifically concerning the line between mainstream media and alternative media and the virtues and or vices of advocacy journalism, I'd just like to let everybody know that what I believe is the most important public health story of the last 5 years in this country, that being the poisoning of an American city of 100,000 people because of politicians who only wanted to save money and did not think through the implications of what they were doing. That story was broken by a man named Kurt Guyette, who I know very well, who used to be the news director or the news editor of Metro Times. When he lost his job, he went to work as an investigative reporter for the Michigan American Civil Liberties Union with the instruction, look into this emergency manager stuff and find out where it leads. And Kurt found out where it led, and he broke that story.
And I have often wondered whether the future of actual investigative journalism is going to have to be funded by foundations.
And interestingly, his salary was paid for, at least in part, by a grant from the Ford Foundation.
Yeah.
And I think it is the most important public health story since I don't know when. And it was done by a guy who was paid to be an advocate. Look into this and find out what it does.
The other thing, a lot of other people, there's always the Me Too. Somebody starts writing and the next one writes, and pretty soon a lot of people started to write about it. What what separated Kurt Guyette from all the others is that he went to Virginia Tech, the college, and had them test the water. They couldn't say anymore that this is a bunch of bullshit, this is fake news, this is whatever, which is a good way to come back to. How do you know if it's accurate reporting when they show you when there's some facts that you can see are facts?
You may question his political beliefs or the political beliefs of the ACLU all you wish, and that is certainly your prerogative.
But that yellow water that tested so high for lead.
When it came to the quality of the journalism, he nailed down every nail. And had he not been working for an advocacy organization, had he instead been working for a traditional news gathering organization, I think he'd have probably won a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, easily. Good point. Barb?
Well, a couple of things. When I was leaving my other job today, and I was kind of filling my boss in on what the program was tonight, he was telling me that in the Jerusalem Post, the most recent one, they had an article on people who have Twitter accounts, like, you know, major Twitter people, who can now buy followers.
Oh, sure.
And here's the thing, it's not, you can buy, depending on how much you spend, if you want to have like 10,000 followers, if you just buy the basic package, these are just basic bots, okay? And they don't really have a profile or anything. And if you pay more money,
you get a profile, you pay more.
You'll get a profile picture, and more money, they will actually flesh out the bot for you. And it's because you want to have all these followers. One way you can tell it's a bot is if it just shared your post but never responded back. But they're working on the algorithm now. But this is one of the things that on Twitter, if you have more people responding, you're going to get more points with Twitter and more, you know, more advertising. So this is one of the things that's going on out there.
Oh, we haven't even gotten into the fact that they're developing video technology that's going to be able to take someone and make them say something they completely never said, and you know, make it look completely realistic. So that's going to be even worse for fake news.
I do want to say one other thing, and then, you know, other people have questions. I have a sister-in-law who she went to journalism school. She is a bona fide journalist working for the Oakland Press. And this last week, the sad, tragic thing that happened up at Central Michigan, she posted online that their affiliate up in Mount Pleasant, an affiliate of Oakland Press, were the ones that actually went out and did the legwork and were the first to really post the correct story on what was happening up there. And I think that maybe instead of just worrying about the girls' basketball team and cutting ribbons, I think maybe some of our grassroots and local papers, if they can hang on, might be some of those journalists who are actually going to produce some of the actual stories.
Well, and there are journalism outlets that are against all odds managing to survive. I don't know if you saw the story of the Saline Post. It's a one-man operation that covers the news in Saline, and he's posted that he couldn't do it anymore. He wasn't making any money. He was working 80 hours a week. He was going to go out of business. And people started sending him $5 and $10 checks, and he's gotten enough money to keep the thing going. So there's still one guy in Saline going to city council and school board because the quote-unquote real paper in Saline folded back in, it was either 07 or 09, I forget, for lack of advertising revenue. And you see, that kind of hyper-local journalism, I think, will continue to survive, but boy, it sure depended on, one person's passion.
Kickstarter campaigns, huh?
Yeah, GoFundMe. Yeah.
Farmington Voice, the same thing.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Or Oakland County Times, Oakland County 115.
Yep. That's right, Crystal Proxmire.
What a dynamo. What a dynamo.
Just a complete dynamo. I think it's 8:30, a little over.
clock's a little slow, I had forgotten, so we're actually closer to 8:45.
Okay, so I want to thank all of you for coming, your great comments.